Welcome to the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Ronald Corthell, the Dean of the College of Humanities, Education, and Social Sciences at Purdue Northwest, and was the head of the English department at Kent State before coming here. Ron's area for his dissertation was 17th century literature. And we are going to talk today about the person who's been announced to be the Nobel Literature Prize winner for 2016, Bobby Zimmerman, otherwise known as Bob Dylan. So, Ron, a lot of interesting things to get at here. One is, what do we mean by literature, and does that apply to someone like Bob Dylan? And then I'd like to maybe also talk about some of the other people who've won in the past and maybe do some comparisons there. But let's get at that. I mean, how do we define literature, and how does that relate to to someone who's has a career of songwriting and popular music?
Yeah, that's a very, as they say, good question. It's a very open question, actually, more so than I think it ever has been. So this is an interesting time for this award to be made to, I think Dylan is the first artist of this, in this genre. Whatever genre, he's kind of hard to pin down to one genre, but he's probably the first music performer who has been named to this prize. So, there's been a lot of controversy in the literary critical field about what does constitute literature. Of course, as you know, because you were an English major, Tom, in the 18th, 17th, and 18th centuries, literature included historical, political texts. I mean, when I was a college student, a student of English literature, I read treatises on, church ecclesiastical order by Richard Hooker. I mean, these are not sort of gripping works.
Reading?
Yeah, exactly. They might be good bedside reading, actually, but in the later, already I think into the 18th century, literature was becoming more narrowly defined as fictional work. So it has to be something that is engaging primarily the imagination. It's not about the real world, but about imaginary worlds. But then, of course, in the 20th century and now in the 21st century, that sort of boundary between fiction and nonfiction is also very challenged. There are many works that are hard to pin down as to whether they are actually fiction or nonfiction, and sometimes they're both. And then you also have the issue of theater. Most of us regard theater as literary, but it's really more than just text on a page. It involves a performance.
Well, there have been a couple people from theater who won the prize. Harold Pinter, I think.
Most recently, Dario Fo, the Italian absurdist playwright. But but not that many.
Well, here's the sticking point for me. When you look at theater or novels, for instance, or even poetry, I know T.S. Eliot, there's a body of work that has themes in it, that there's stylistic development that's sort of consistent throughout that, and you can follow it. I don't know that I see that if I look at Bob Dylan. I see someone who's writing popular songs. I think he writes great lines. I've memorized a lot of them, but I don't know that I can look at Bob Dylan from year to year and see someone who's articulating a message. Faulkner, for instance, won the prize and gave a very often quoted famous speech about that, and he articulated in his speech the themes that he was writing about in his work. Is Dylan going to be able to do that? What do you think? You're familiar with his lyrics, but is there an argument he can make there?
He's such a chameleon, I think. I mean, we've talked about him in the past, and he has gone through so many different phases, and he's now, I don't know if this is towards the end of his career or not. Who knows? He's 75, I think. But most recently, he's kind of turned away from what he had been doing, and he's doing what he calls the Great American Songbook. So he's singing Sinatra music and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's a very good point. I think most of the Nobel laureates have somehow become associated with a theme. I think with Dylan, it's more his. In a way, it's literally and figuratively, his voice is inseparable from anything. I mean, his songs don't sound like the same songs when somebody else sings them. And a lot of people have sung his songs very beautifully, like Joan Baez, for example, and Joni Mitchell, and they trade off. But his just sound totally different when he sings them, and they're kind of connected with his voice.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, if we look at something that he was really known for, right? It was his protest music of the early '60s. He writes "Blown in the Wind," and then "Times They Are Changing," right? Come gather around people wherever you roam, admit that the waters around
Masters
you
of
have grown.
War.
Masters of War. And then he does this Playboy interview in 1963 and says, "I'm not the leader of a protest movement. I'm just a guy who's writing songs." And if you follow him later on in his career, he writes a song, "Things Have Changed." And the chorus of the song is, "I used to care, but things have changed." So if we have to go beyond what he's saying about politics to see who he is, what's left? If there's a voice there, how do you describe that voice? It's not necessarily a voice of protest, right?
No, I agree. I think that was a very early part of his work, and I think his voice. What I would connect it with is painful experience, reflection, striving for some kind of clarity. They're not really political or social type themes. They're more individual themes of somebody dealing with bad experiences mainly. That's what most literature is about. So
he sort of became known during the hippie phase of music and culture, the late '60s, middle '60s to late '60s. But I think it would be more accurate to describe him as a beat. I think he fits better with the Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac model, someone who has sort of rejected by society and is rejected by society and kind of doesn't care. And that theme I see that all the way through this, right? And it sort of fit with that hippie movement, but it didn't fit with the hippies like John Lennon who wanted to change the world. Dylan never would have written Imagine. Right?
No, never. Closest he got was, Lay Lady Lay or some awful song like
ridiculous.
that.
I mean, certainly written, but that's another issue which we need to get to. What about all the bad stuff that he wrote, right? But so Dylan was more about rejecting being categorized and rejecting being recognized. And so it wouldn't surprise me at all if he rejected this award because that's kind of that's the theme. If there's any theme, it's like I don't want to be part of your club.
I think
how is that worth being a Nobel laureate?
Right. I think your point about the beats is very interesting because I think what I associate the beats with most of all is it's a kind of cool that is countercultural or against the mainstream, and I think that is a very distinctive part of his, if you want to call it, his literary persona. He doesn't want to be pinned down to anything. He's always been, I think, impossibly cool. Like,
see, well, here's my point.
Who is
then, right?
this guy? He's just so different and so unusual.
So cool is really a negative quality, right? It's sort of a rejection of what is accepted or what's in.
Not necessarily. Maybe I was thinking of another term than cool, and it was. But I've lost it.
Well,
now.
it's sort of, you know, I mean, to put it in another context, right? In heavyweight boxing, you know, if you're in a championship fight, you're supposed to beat the champ. You don't counterpunch 15 rounds and say survived and say I won. Right. You know, and it seems to me that the beat movement, you know, they're counterpunchers. I don't see a message in any of that. I don't see a theme. I just see, you know, this desire to be outside the group. I
mean, I think he also cultivated, and from very early age, this idea of this is what I was looking for. Yeah. The genius. Yeah. I mean, he wanted to be. I don't know if he wanted to be this or not, but he certainly gave every indication of wanting to be regarded as, or maybe genius is a wrong word. Maybe the word is a more literary word. The bard. Right. Bardic. Like he's connected to, you know, really mysterious, special kind of worlds. And so a lot of his songs are bardic. They're sort of prophetic. They sound like Old Testament prophecies. They actually draw on Old Testament prophecies. So, you know,
historical models of this, Homer, Shakespeare, in American literature, would you say?
Well, I think the one that everybody compares him to, and I think it's a good comparison, is Walt Whitman.
Yeah, okay,
very much so.
So I mean, you know, would you say Whitman had you know, something that he owned, or was Whitman just reflecting and converting things that were going on around him into?
No, I think Whitman was, you know, there you can really find a consistency and an overarching sort of theme to his life, and it's about, you know, the richness of America, the American spirit, the individual as being somehow also everybody. He's got I think a real definable core to his work.
And that's essentially what we're looking for. Is there a definable core here?
And I guess I don't see that in Dylan.
Yeah, and I don't either. So we're going to take a quick break. The Calumet Roundtable will be right back. Welcome back to the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach. Today our guest is Dr. Ron Corthell, and we are talking about Bob Dylan, the 2016 recipient of the Nobel Prize for Literature. We've been critical of this decision in the first part of the show, and I just want to say that I think we need to acknowledge, of course, that Dylan has had his moments of greatness. And I just wanted to mention a couple songs that stand out for me. He wrote a parody of Norwegian Wood called Fourth Time Around, which I think is just brilliant. And he actually, when he recorded it on Blonde on Blonde, put a different arrangement behind it and spun it differently. But there's a soundtrack for the movie Wonder Boys that has Dylan singing this while he's playing Norwegian Wood, and it matches up line for line
Yeah.
with every one of Lennon's lines in Norwegian Wood. And that's really, you know, the beauty of this is just, you know, layers and layers deep, because Norwegian Wood was Lennon being Lennon. It's probably Lennon's most, you know, peculiarly Lennon lyric. And so Dylan picked that lyric to parody, and it's just, you know, it's hysterical funny. I mean, he's, you know, he's talking to some girl and he takes his gum out and, you know, offers her some, and it just, you know, it's ridiculous. But so there's that. There's all along the Watchtower where he talks about the Joker and the thief in the first verse, and then in the second verse they're giving the opposite advice to one another. And then that song that I mentioned earlier, Things Have Changed, really a brilliant, well-composed song, line for line. I think, you know, those are some of the songs that almost can read like poetry. And, you know, Give the Devil His Due. You know, I think that there are certainly things there that qualify. And maybe it hurt him that he came on the scene during the hippie era with that poster. I think it started in I Magazine, and then they put it in his greatest hits album of him with, you know, the outline with all of the hair and everything.
Right.
And, you know, maybe it's just hard for us to take him seriously, but it just seems to me that things have been a little bit uneven, to say the least. And I guess that's sort of the you know, the crux of what we're saying here.
You know, one of the comments that you made struck with me. A few years ago, there was a lot of writing about Dylan as possibly a plagiarist.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there were people who were raising this issue that, you know, he basically stole much of his material and never acknowledged, you know, his sources, and was just channeling a lot of other great songwriters. Well, and I think that that's an interesting part of his work. And I don't see it as plagiarism. In fact, you know, everybody knows that the same thing could be said about Shakespeare.
Well, yeah, certainly.
You know, he took all of his stories from everybody.
Right.
But he obviously was able to take that material and turn it in a special way.
Well, in Dylan's defense, I mean, everybody was doing that in the early 60s. Right. Paul Simon and Dylan actually have songs that I think they both put their names on, that are both takeoffs on the same traditional song on both of their early albums.
But I mean, I think one of the strong features of Dylan's work, you said that we were being negative, and I don't think we were totally negative.
Yeah, but the Dylan fans are going to hate us. I'm sorry.
I think,
you
no,
know,
I can make a case for him getting the award. You know, I don't find it to be outrageous by any stretch. I think it's deserved in many respects. But, you know, that is one aspect of him, I think, that gives him some real cultural weight, is that he does absorb so much from American song.
And that's Whitman-esque.
Folk. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And he sucks it in, and then
that's Shakespeare.
He gives it his own flavor, and then lets it out with that voice, puts it out with that voice that I mentioned before. So I mean, I think that's a strength, not a criticism of him.
Well,
the fact
is he
that
providing
then
a literary critique, a commentary on his culture? I mean, can we go that far?
I just don't see him as being that. I used to think when I was a kid, when he was just coming up, that he was a satirist mainly. And
certainly, he was one of his strengths.
Yeah, I think even more than the social protest, there was more of the satirical side. I mean, those songs on the early albums, Freewheelin', they're satires really. They're not protest songs. And
well, and sometimes he's beyond satire. I mean, he's just making really cruel.
Right.
You know, one of the most amazing metaphors I've ever read is he says, I think it's in Gates of Eden. He says, it's almost hard to track this. He says, at dawn my lover comes and tells me of her dreams. Now I'm paraphrasing, but I think I've got this. Dawn my lover comes and tells me of her dreams, but I haven't the time to shovel a glimpse into the ditch of what each one means.
Wow, yeah.
You know, you know, like a Rolling Stone. I mean, it's you know, it's really some really negative, cutting comments in there, but that's what he excelled at in a lot of ways.
Right.
You know?
I agree.
Yeah.
I find that much more, that's much more appealing in his work to me than some of his, the period when he was trying to do some of the country western stuff, which the Nashville skyline and that sort of thing. I didn't much care for that.
Yeah.
And so.
Lay Lady Lay.
Yeah.
I just always thought he must have been kidding. It must have been a joke.
Right.
So, you know, I wanted to mention that he's sort of been sort of a historical phenomena in some ways. He has been in on, you know, so many important things. He did the song about the hurricane.
Yeah, right.
You know, about
Jack Johnson.
the Carter, who was wrongly imprisoned. The war protests at the beginning of the protest movement, and I happened to be present for something that, you know, I'll never get over. I think it was 1974. Nixon resigned, and Dylan had not played a concert in a couple of years. He had this supposed motorcycle accident, was sort of, you know, working on his basement tapes with the band, and had been out of sight. And he scheduled a tour, and it started in Chicago. And I saw him on the second night of this tour, and at the old stadium that the Bulls used to play at. And he was doing, it might have been Gates of Eden again, I think. But the line was, even the President of the United States sometimes must have to stand naked, right? And he got to that line, and the, you know, the president had just resigned or was about to resign, and the stadium just erupted, and people were stomping up and down, and the building was shaking, and the band lost track of where they were. It was so loud, and they had to do a couple of measures and go around a couple of times before he could catch back up with them and pick up the song again, you know. And I just thought that was so symbolic of the impact he had. He wasn't just sort of outside of what was going on singing about it. He was in the middle of it. He was impacting it, you know, and things changed because of it, even though he claimed he didn't want to have that role.
Right. I mean, he didn't make any kind of the very specific references to social issues, you know, like Oxford Town and Free Will, and you know, those are very few and far between, I think, in his work.
Well, right.
You know,
it's
more of a kind of a indirect sort of reflection, refraction, you know, that you get that sense of the critique and the satire, and
So some people that you might think of who might be awarded this prize, if you were going to songwriters, to pop performers, Leonard Cohen comes to mind. Cohen's lyrics, I think, almost could be read as poetry, right? He's also a poet, and I
think they're more poetic on the whole. Than Dylan's
and more consistent, right? You know, and you might throw Springsteen in there, although I think Springsteen's more uneven, like Dylan is. But I think some of Springsteen's songs, like Philadelphia, really transcend and become sublime in a true literary sense. What do you feel about that? What do you think about that?
I can't, you know, I was thinking about this. What other, is this going to open the door to other performers and musical artists getting nominated for the prize? I don't think it will, because I was having trouble coming up with very many names. You know, I thought of Springsteen right away, but again, I think he has less historical significance, cultural significance than Dylan does, important as he is. And
but probably more thematic consistency.
He does, He's got he's definitely, you know, everybody. That's why all his fans love him so much. He's the boss, you know. He's Bruce, and that's from the beginning right up to now. So, and I guess his new autobiography is really a killer. It's supposed to be very, very good. And Dylan does have, you know, some writing as well. And we've talked about his the beginning of his autobiography, Chronicles Part 1. I don't know if he's going to do Part 2 or not.
Well, and, you know,
but it got very well received.
You never know if what you're reading is real or not, because he's just throwing out so many disguises at talking about himself. I read his first book, Tarantula, which came out
I never read
60s,
that
and it
because the reviews were so horrible.
Well,
that I
but,
decided
it's
I
one of the
didn't
reasons
wanna
I've
read
always
it.
had trouble taking him seriously from a literary sense, because it's like his songs. It's a lot of good lines, but they didn't necessarily make paragraphs and chapters, you know, and it was odd.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, okay, so before we close here, there were a couple other authors that we thought maybe should have been considered this year for the prize. We mentioned Philip Roth, and you had a couple others.
Yeah, yeah. I was kind of surprised that this was the year they picked Dylan, because Roth very publicly announced that he was essentially retiring from writing, and he certainly has a huge oeuvre, you know, behind him. The other ones that people have talked about of American writers are of the American writing is Don DeLillo, who's equal. One that I mentioned that I think has great cultural clout is Thomas Pynchon.
Sure.
As well. I could very easily see him put up. And then there's a Japanese novelist who has achieved world recognition named Haruki Murakami, who's also written about 25 novels, and his work is instantly translated into English, and he's quite well known internationally. So I don't know how big of an international star, literary star, Philip Roth is, however, or Don DeLillo. I don't know if they're more American, more identified with American writing or not.
Well, that may be a factor here, because, because another singer-songwriter that I would say I would consider above Dylan, actually, because I think her work is more consistent and more composed, is Joni Mitchell, particularly her Blue album and Court and Spark.
Right.
But you know, one of the things that Dylan...
She was an artist that, I think it was the gender thing, female. She's been marginalized. She was really important. Yeah.
So, you know, so maybe Dylan's, you know, world reputation, right, it had a bigger factor here. We're just looking at him as another American composer. That is all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Ron Corthell for joining us today on the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach. Have a great day.